The bar was called the Rusty Anchor. It sat 3 blocks from the Pacific Ocean in a California coastal town that had seen better decades. The kind of place where the neon sign in the window buzzed instead of glowed, where the bartender remembered your name before he remembered your order, where the booths along the back wall held the weight of conversations that were never meant to leave the room. On a Thursday evening in the autumn of 1993, roughly 41 people occupied that space. Most of them were locals. Most of them were unremarkable. One of them was about to make the worst decision of his adult life, and he would spend the better part of the next 2 decades trying to explain it away at dinner tables and in deposition-style tellings to people who had not been there. His name was Garrett Holloway. He was 37 years old. He had served 8 years in the United States Navy, the last 4 of which were spent as a certified SEAL, deployed across 3 theaters of operation that the government still does not discuss in detail on public record. He had been awarded a service commendation. He had trained with men whose names appear in the footnotes of military history. He could cover 200 meters of open water in under 3 minutes. He had survived field conditions that reduce ordinary men to something unrecognizable. By any reasonable measure, Garrett Holloway was a formidable human being. He was not, however, the most dangerous man in that bar. He did not know that yet. The other man had arrived 30 minutes earlier. He had taken a stool at the far end of the counter, ordered something plain, and watched the room the way certain people watch rooms, not with suspicion, but with a kind of deep, patient awareness that registers details without appearing to register anything at all. He was 53 years old. He wore a collared shirt, unremarkable. His hands rested flat on the bar. He was not large in the way that announces itself. He was compact in the way that does not. His name was Charles Ray Norris, and he held, at that point in his life, 10 black belts across 6 distinct martial disciplines, a record of 168 wins and 10 losses as a competitive fighter, and a personal philosophy about confrontation that he had articulated the same way in every interview, every seminar, and every private conversation for 30 years. The goal is always to end it before it begins. Garrett Holloway did not recognize him. That was the first mistake. Within 5 minutes, Holloway would speak 4 sentences that he could not take back. Within a further 4 minutes and approximately 30 seconds, those sentences would have consequences he had not planned for. 41 people in that room witnessed what followed. Not a single one of them was laughing when it ended. If you have never heard this story told in full, stay with this. It takes time to do justice to. And it is worth the time. Garrett Holloway had been out of the service for 16 months when that Thursday arrived. The transition from military life to civilian life is a topic that generals and psychologists and policy committees have spent decades failing to adequately describe. What it amounts to, in practical terms, is this. A man who has spent years in a world structured entirely around hierarchy, purpose, and physical dominance is suddenly placed in a world that has none of those things, and is expected to navigate it without a map. Some men manage that transition with grace. Others manage it with effort. A small number manage it by carrying the hierarchy into every room they enter, and measuring every stranger against standards the stranger did not agree to be measured by. Holloway was not a violent man in the clinical sense. He had not been arrested. He had not started fights in the way that courts document. But the people who knew him in those 16 months would later describe him with a specific phrase that appeared in 3 separate accounts independently of one another. They described him as a man who needed the room to know. He needed the room to understand what he had been, what he had done, what he was capable of. He wore it not loudly, but persistently, the way some men wear cologne, present in every moment, impossible to ignore once noticed. He had been at the Rusty Anchor for approximately 90 minutes by the time he noticed the man at the end of the bar. He had consumed 2 beers, neither of which had impaired him in any meaningful way. He was, by the account of Marcus Yuen, the bartender on duty that evening, engaged in conversation with 2 other patrons about a subject Yuen could not later recall. What Yuen did recall was the exact moment Holloway's attention shifted. Someone at the bar said the name Chuck Norris. The context was casual, a comment about a film, a throwaway line, the kind of cultural shorthand that passes between people without weight. But something in the way the name landed in the room caused Holloway to turn his head. And Holloway looked at the man at the end of the bar. And something passed across his face that Yuen would describe as a calculation. Holloway set down his beer. He said something to the 2 men beside him. They laughed. He stood up. What happened next is the reason this story has been told, retold, and quietly archived in the memory of everyone who was present for it. This channel has spent the better part of 2 years documenting moments like this one. Moments when the gap between a man's self-assessment and reality becomes visible to everyone in the room simultaneously. If you have not yet found us, and this is the first story you have watched, consider that there are 43 more waiting for you. Each one is a different man, a different room, a different 5 minutes that changed something. If the story we are telling right now is resonating with something you have felt or seen or carried, subscribe before we go further. The next 7 minutes are the part of this story that most people find hardest to sit with. Holloway crossed the bar. He took a position approximately 4 feet from the man at the end of the counter. He said, in a voice that was audible to at least 6 of the nearest patrons, the following: "You're Chuck Norris, aren't you?" It was not a question. It was an opening move. The man at the end of the bar turned his head slowly. He looked at Holloway the way a geologist looks at rock formations, not with hostility, but with a kind of scientific patience, as if whatever he saw had already been categorized before the looking was complete. He said yes. Holloway nodded. He said he had seen the movies. He said he thought they were good entertainment. And then he said the sentence, delivered with the measured, almost clinical confidence of a man who had rehearsed it without knowing he was rehearsing it. He said, "But I always figured the real thing was probably a little soft around the edges." The bar did not go quiet all at once. It went quiet the way water drains, gradually, then completely. Marcus Yuen later said he stopped wiping the glass in his hand without deciding to. The 2 men Holloway had been speaking with exchanged a look. A woman in the booth nearest the counter, a local school teacher named Patricia Odom, would later describe the silence as the kind that has its own texture. Chuck Norris looked at Garrett Holloway for a long moment. He did not change his expression. He did not shift his weight. He did not perform. He said, with a calm that the people nearest him described as almost geological in its depth, "Why don't you sit down and I'll buy you a drink?" It was a door. It was a door that opened both ways, and the only cost of walking through it peacefully was a small and quiet dignity, the kind that costs nothing except the willingness to accept it. Holloway did not walk through the door. He said, "I spent 8 years as a Navy SEAL. I've been in places you've seen in movies. I don't need a drink from an actor." There it was. The full declaration. The credential stack deployed as a weapon. The dismissal completed. 41 people now fully and silently present. Chuck Norris set down his glass. He turned on the bar stool so that he was fully facing Holloway. He looked at him without urgency. He said, quietly enough that only the nearest 4 or 5 people heard it clearly, "I understand. I appreciate your service." And then he waited. What Chuck Norris was doing in that moment is something that martial artists, psychologists, and military strategists have each described using different terminology, but identical underlying logic. He was creating space. Not physical space. The distance between them had not changed. He was creating temporal space. He was giving Holloway one more opportunity to recognize the door and step through it. In the disciplines Norris had spent 40 years mastering, this is not generosity in the sentimental sense. It is precision. It is the understanding that a conflict avoided is a conflict won. And that the only way to avoid a conflict with a man like Holloway is to give him a path that does not require him to lose face in order to take it. Holloway did not take the path. He said, 8 years of real training. 4 deployments, and you want me to believe a guy who does roundhouse kicks in movies is the real thing. He paused for exactly the duration required to make the next word land with maximum weight. He said, please. The time was approximately 8:47 in the evening. What followed occupied the next 4 minutes and 31 seconds. In the memory of every person present, it occupied considerably longer. Chuck Norris stood up from the bar stool. He was, as has been noted, not a large man by the measurements that impress at a distance. He stood 5 feet 10 inches. He weighed, at that period of his life, approximately 175 pounds. He had the build of a man who has spent decades developing functional strength rather than visible strength. The kind of musculature that does not announce itself in a collared shirt and only becomes apparent in motion. He stood with his feet at a width that most people would describe as simply standing. In the vocabulary of Tong Soo Do, of Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, of the 7 other systems encoded in his body over 4 decades of daily practice, he was already positioned. He said, let's step outside and talk. He did not say it with menace. He said it with the same quiet flatness he had used throughout. Several witnesses later noted that his voice had not changed in register or pace at any point in the exchange. Not when the insult landed, not when Holloway escalated, not now. The consistency of it was, in the memory of Marcus Yuen, more unsettling than any display of anger would have been. They went outside. 14 of the 41 people in the bar followed. Patricia Odom was among them. A man named Dennis Cartwright, a retired plumber who had been drinking at the Rusty Anchor on Thursday evenings for 11 years, was among them. A younger man, 24 years old, who worked at the marina and whose name has not been made part of the public record, was among them. The parking lot behind the Rusty Anchor was imperfectly lit. A sodium lamp at the lot's far corner produced a yellow light that fell unevenly across the asphalt. It was cool, close to 58 degrees. There was no wind worth noting. These are the details that witnesses recall with disproportionate clarity when something extraordinary happens in an ordinary place. The temperature, the quality of the light, the sound of their own breathing. Holloway positioned himself in the open space between 2 parked vehicles. He adopted a stance that was recognizable to anyone with combat training, weight distributed. Hands slightly raised, not in a formal guard, but in the looser, field-tested posture of a man who has spent years in physical confrontation. He was, by the later assessment of 2 martial arts instructors who reviewed the accounts independently, correctly positioned for a striking exchange against most opponents. He was not facing most opponents. Chuck Norris stood at a distance of approximately 9 feet. He did not adopt a stance that was visible to the observers. He simply stood. His hands were at his sides. His breathing was not audible to anyone present. Dennis Cartwright, who was closest to him, said later that the thing he remembered most was not what Norris looked like, but what he did not look like. He did not look afraid. He did not look angry. He did not look like a man calculating. He looked like a man who had already finished calculating and was simply waiting for the mathematics to play out. Here is something that very few people outside of serious martial training understand about distance in a physical confrontation. The untrained mind processes distance as a simple measurement. 9 feet is 9 feet. The trained mind processes distance as time. 9 feet, in the context of two standing men, represents approximately 1.2 seconds of movement at combat speed. What appears, to an observer, as a significant gap is, to a practitioner of Norris's caliber, a measurement that carries different information. It tells him how much time he has to read, to respond, and to decide. Against a trained opponent, 9 feet requires absolute readiness. Against an opponent whose training is real, but whose understanding of this particular gap is incomplete, 9 feet is something else. It is almost an advantage. Holloway moved first. He covered the distance with the aggressive forward momentum of a man who had been trained to close space quickly and decisively. He moved well. Several observers noted that. He was not stumbling. He was not reckless. He was, by the measure of what most men in that parking lot had ever witnessed, moving with impressive intention. He crossed approximately 6 of the 9 feet. What happened in the next 3 seconds has been described by 14 witnesses in 14 separate accounts. And the accounts agree on every essential point, while disagreeing only on the minor phenomenology of speed. The consensus is as follows. Norris did not retreat. He moved laterally, a step and a quarter to his left, a movement so compact and so precisely timed that several witnesses described it as having happened before Holloway arrived rather than as a response to his arrival. In the same motion, not following it, simultaneous with it, his right hand made contact with Holloway's lead arm, redirecting its trajectory by a matter of degrees that, at that speed and with that force, amounted to complete neutralization. Holloway's momentum, considerable and committed, carried him past the space Norris had occupied a fraction of a second earlier. Holloway did not fall. He recovered. He turned. He turned into a controlled grip that had already located his right wrist and his left shoulder in the half-second of his recovery. The grip did not squeeze. It positioned. And the positioning, applied with the quiet mechanical efficiency of a man who has performed this or its equivalent on a mat, in a ring, and in 3 documented field situations across his career, placed Holloway in a geometry from which the available exits were limited to 2. The first exit required him to stop. The second exit required him to continue, at which point the geometry would resolve itself according to physics rather than intention, and the resolution would involve the asphalt. Holloway, to his credit, recognized this within approximately 1.5 seconds. He stopped. The 2 men were close now, closer than the 9 feet they had started with, closer than any of the observers were entirely comfortable with from the outside looking in. Norris held the position for a moment that Dennis Cartwright estimated at 4 seconds and Patricia Odom estimated at considerably longer. The sodium lamp threw its yellow light across both of them. Neither man moved. And then Chuck Norris released his grip. Completely, both hands dropped to his sides, the same position they had occupied when he had simply been standing. He took 1 step back. He looked at Holloway with the same expression he had worn at the bar. Not triumph, not contempt, not the performance of a lesson delivered. Something more difficult to name. Something that the witnesses, reaching for language afterward, described variously as respect, sadness, and, in the case of the young man from the marina, simply as quiet. He said something to Holloway. He said it quietly enough that only Holloway heard it. Only Holloway, and by Holloway's own later account, the specific and private part of himself that he had been trying to outrun for 16 months. What Norris said, as Holloway would recount it years later to a journalist who included it in a longer profile. "You made it through 8 years of the hardest thing this country asks of its people. That's not soft. Don't let a bad night tell you different." Holloway did not respond. He stood in the yellow light of the parking lot for a moment that no one who was present has been able to reduce to a precise measurement. Then he nodded. Once, he walked back inside the bar. He sat at a different seat than the one he had occupied before. He did not finish his drink. He left 19 minutes later. Chuck Norris returned to the bar as well. He sat back on the stool at the far end of the counter. He picked up his glass. Marcus Ewan refilled it without being asked. The bar, slowly, began to sound like a bar again. No one laughed. Not then, and not in the retellings. The story has been passed through those 14 witnesses across 30 years, and in every telling. The laughter is the thing that is specifically noted as having been absent. It is one of the more interesting details. Confrontations of this kind, when they go the way they went in that parking lot, often produce a release, a nervous collective exhale that tips into something lighter. This one did not. The people who were there describe leaving with a feeling they have difficulty naming. Something that sits between reverence and sorrow, and the specific discomfort of having watched a man meet himself. The reasons for that are worth examining. They say something about what Chuck Norris actually is, which is a more complicated question than his filmography suggests. By 1993, Norris had been a practitioner of martial arts for 34 years. He had begun studying Tong Sodo in 1958 while serving in the United States Air Force in South Korea. He had earned his black belt in 1961. What followed that first black belt was not a career in the conventional sense. It was an accumulation, deliberate, patient, and structured around a philosophy that he had articulated in various forms across 4 decades of interviews, and that reduced, at its core, to a single idea: the art does not end. You do not arrive. You continue. He trained in Okinawan karate. He trained in Brazilian jiu-jitsu at a time when almost no one in North America was paying attention to it, under the instruction of the Machado brothers, who were cousins of the Gracie family and among the most technically sophisticated practitioners on the continent. He trained in judo. He trained in taekwondo. He holds black belts in Tong Sudo, taekwondo, and Brazilian jiu-jitsu, the latter being one he earned in his 50s, at an age when most men have made their peace with not acquiring new things. He founded his own system, Chan Kuk Do, which incorporated elements from multiple disciplines and which had, by the early 1990s, produced thousands of practitioners across hundreds of schools worldwide. He had competed, not at the level of footnote, at the level of record. He won the Professional Middleweight Karate Championship in 1968 and held it for 6 consecutive years. He did not lose that title in competition. He retired it. That distinction matters to people who understand competitive fighting. He had also, and this is the part that the parking lot story makes visible, long since passed through the phase of his training where any of this required demonstration. The paradox of genuine mastery, in martial arts, in music, in any discipline organized around long practice, is that it becomes increasingly invisible to the people most likely to challenge it. The man who has spent 10,000 hours becoming genuinely dangerous looks at rest like any other man. He does not hold himself differently in ways that announce themselves. He does not scan the room with theatrical alertness. He does not make his history available. He simply sits at a bar and orders something plain and watches the room with the quiet attention of a man who has already made peace with what he can do. Garrett Holloway had looked at that man and seen softness. He had looked at a decade's worth of film appearances and mistaken the medium for the man. It is a forgivable error in the abstract. In the parking lot behind the Rusty Anchor, it was an expensive one. The mercy in the story is real, and it is worth being precise about it. When Chuck Norris released his grip in that parking lot, he was not being generous in the way that word is commonly used. He was not performing restraint for the benefit of the 14 observers. He was not making a point about his own magnanimity. What he was doing, and this is something he has described in his own words across decades of interviews, seminars, and the memoir he published in 2004, was making a distinction that his entire career had been built around. The distinction between the capacity for force and the application of it. He has said, in various formulations across his public life, that the most important lesson he learned in 34 years of martial training was not a technique. It was not a combination, not a stance, not a system. It was the understanding that the moment you are capable of genuine damage is the moment you become most responsible for choosing not to cause it. That the strength which cannot be controlled is not strength at all, but simply a liability waiting for a circumstance. In the parking lot, Holloway had given him a circumstance. He had also given him a man, a specific, particular man who was struggling with something that had nothing to do with Chuck Norris, who had walked into a bar carrying the weight of a transition that was breaking him quietly, who had found in a famous face at the end of a counter a target for something that did not have a proper target. Norris had seen that. He had seen it before Holloway crossed the room. The release of the grip was not weakness, and it was not performance. It was diagnosis, administered by a man who had spent decades learning to read what a confrontation is actually about beneath the surface of what it appears to be about. What he said to Holloway in those few private seconds was not a lecture. It was not a moral. It was the acknowledgement of a man by another man, stripped of the noise of the preceding 8 minutes, delivered in the language of one person who has been through hard things to another. Holloway would not speak about the incident publicly for 11 years. When he eventually addressed it, in a brief passage in an interview he gave for a veterans publication, he did not describe it as a humiliation. He described it as a reckoning. He said, and this is the word he used with what appeared to the journalist to be deliberate precision, that it was the first time in 16 months that someone had looked at him and seen the person rather than the credential. He said he had gone back inside and sat in a different seat because he did not want to look at the space where he had been standing when he was still the person he had been trying to be. He got help, not immediately and not without difficulty, but he got it. He is, by the accounts available, living a life that has room in it for more than the thing he was trying to hold on to in that parking lot. The story does not belong to the parking lot. The parking lot was 40 seconds of physics and geometry. The story belongs to what was said in the quiet afterward and what was carried out of that sodium-lit asphalt space by a man who had expected to walk out of it feeling something else. There is a version of this story that is simple. Man mocks legend. Legend proves point. Man leaves humbled. That version is available in 100 tellings, and it is not wrong. Exactly. It just isn't the thing. The thing is that Chuck Norris had more options in that parking lot than Garrett Holloway did. Not physical options. That arithmetic had been settled in the first 3 seconds. Moral options. He could have extended what had happened. He could have let the geometry resolve itself at full consequence. He could have allowed 41 people and a sodium lamp to be witnesses to a demonstration. He chose not to, and the choosing was not passive. It was the active exercise of everything his training had actually been about, which was not the accumulation of capacity for damage, but the accumulation of the judgment required to know when damage serves no purpose. The question that the Rusty Anchor story quietly asks, and this is why it does not fade, why the 14 people who were in that parking lot still tell it 30 years later with the same specific absence of laughter, is not what Chuck Norris could do. The question is, what he chose not to do, and whether the person watching this story has ever found themselves in the position of Garrett Holloway. Not necessarily in a parking lot, not necessarily in a physical confrontation, but in a room, facing someone who could answer you in a language you were not prepared for, and chose instead to hand you a door. Most men, at some point, are Holloway. Most men walk into a room carrying something they do not have the words for, and find a target that isn't the right target, and say a thing they cannot take back. The grace in the story is not that Norris stopped it. The grace is that he did so in a way that left Holloway something to carry out of the parking lot besides consequences. The aphorism that Chuck Norris has returned to most consistently across 30 years of public speaking, seminars, and interviews is not about strength. It is not about discipline. It is not about winning. It is this: the measure of what a man has learned is not what he can do when he has to, but what he chooses not to do when he could. In the parking lot behind the Rusty Anchor, on a Thursday evening in the autumn of 1993, at approximately 8 minutes and 40 seconds past the moment a retired Navy SEAL said the words soft around the edges, that principle was demonstrated in front of 14 witnesses who did not laugh when it was over. They did not laugh because they had just watched something that does not produce laughter. They had watched a man hand another man his dignity back at the exact moment when the geometry of the situation required nothing of the sort. Nobody in that parking lot was the same person leaving as they had been walking in. That is not something most confrontations can say. The next story in this series concerns a moment in 1988 at a martial arts tournament in Dallas, Texas, where a two-time world champion told Chuck Norris that his career was finished. The world champion was 31 years old. Norris was 48. What happened over the following 6 minutes in a room with 212 witnesses is a story about what 40 years of refinement looks like against a man at his absolute physical peak, and why the outcome surprised everyone in that room except one of the two men involved. That story is already waiting.